Welcome to the place where we learn about and learn from the leaders in our field who are powering human creativity. I am Aaron Dworkin, and this is Arts Engines. Thanks again for joining me here on Arts Engines. Today's guest is Jocelyn Buckner, who serves as Professor of Theater Studies at Chapman University's College of the Performing Arts. Jocelyn, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, I am so excited to talk to you. Chapman's obviously been one of our longtime wonderful creative partners, helping us to curate this show in particular. And what I was hoping we could get into, because you do a lot of work in this area, is just thinking about the role of identity, the intersections, representations of race, class, gender, sexuality, etc., in contemporary plays, and especially those written by playwrights of color, feminist playwrights, etc. So just overall, I'd like to, and as we kind of delve into some of these questions, I'm curious, and maybe my first question really is just going to the why. Why is this important that we think about the way in which these issues are conveyed through the repertoire that we have within the field? Why is it important? And then I'll kind of want to go beyond that into kind of how does it actually get incorporated, et cetera. But first, kind of just the why in terms of its importance.
Perfect. Thank you. Oh, well, those are two of my favorite questions, why and how. And then my third favorite question is, so what? So I'm glad you started with why. But why? Art is always a reflection of society. It's reflecting who we are as individuals and as a community, but it's also responding to society and in some ways pushing against society. And, issues of representation in terms of gender and race, sexuality, class, have long been a component of theatrical works, right? If we look specifically at American theater history, representation has often been something that has been used as a weapon against individuals in marginalized communities, against the global majority, against women, against socioeconomically disadvantaged individuals, right? We have a long history of stereotype and negative representation in the arts. And so I think it's really, really important as a historian, as a dramaturg who uses research to support productions, as a scholar myself, and as a human being, a member of our society who's invested in artistic work and collaboration and the communication that comes out of art. I think it's really important to look at those histories very critically and openly and understand where and how those representations came about and why. Of course, we're asking why here. And then think about how do those historic representations that may not be accurate, may be incredibly stereotypical or difficult to look at now, how do they continue to influence contemporary representations today, both in theater, but then also in other kinds of entertainment and media, right? Film, television, music, it's fashion, et cetera, right? It's a very, very broad spectrum here. And when we think about how we express identity creatively, but how do those historical representations continue to influence what's happening today? And how are we working to subvert those damaging representations now? How are contemporary artists, rewriting the narrative of representation in terms of representation of self, but also representation of other, and creating a larger conversation about who we are as a collective and how we engage with one another across similarities, but also maybe more importantly, difference?
So it's obviously it's such important work, and so I'm curious, kind of, as you look at everything that you have researched and studied, as you look at it, do you find that there are methods that have tended to create more impact, um, be more ultimately create more ultimately successful artistic works or creations? Do you find there's any methods or approaches or examples that you think are important and would be important for our audience to kind of know about or think about as they're even going about their own work and saying, what can help be informing me as I'm trying to do some of this work?
Sure. So now we're asking how, right? How do we interrogate
A
the
very
history?
long way.
Yeah, no, but I think it's important, right? To know that that's what we're getting to is the how. And so I think I think there's a lot of great examples right now of artists who are doing this kind of work. And I think, particularly successful means of getting at interrogating representation and intersectionality of different identity components are works that ask questions, perhaps really open questions about why and where these traditions and these beliefs and these stereotypes come from, and why they persist, why they perpetuate, and then try to provide an alternative viewpoint, right? I think a terrific example of that is American playwright Brandon Jacobs Jenkins. He consistently works in historical representation, and he's consistently exploring ideas of adaptation in his work. For example, he has an adaptation of a very, very famous 19th century melodrama called The Octoroon. He has an adaptation of it called An Octoroon that really interrogates not only the melodramatic structure of storytelling, which was wildly popular in the 19th century and continues to be wildly popular today. You can't turn on a television without seeing a melodrama today. It's just in a different form, right? But then he also is interrogating, very, very fundamental American ideas about class, about race, about immigration, about sexuality, and how all of those things come together in the original play by Dion Boucicault, written just before the explosion of the Civil War, right? And how those issues of identity continue to be fundamental flashpoints of our cultural conflicts and our cultural conversations today, and why some people might look at that play and go, oh, that's kind of a museum piece at this point. Why would we want to produce that? But in fact, he has created this adaptation that explains how clearly and illustrates how clearly these issues continue to be underlying components of the fabric of our American culture.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's so, so important. And it's amazing just seeing and understanding both the depth of impact that storytelling can have, but also the way, right? The manner, the methods in which it can be most effective. And you've also kind of delved in this. You served as editor for a scholarly collection. Just wondering if you could share just a little bit more about that, and especially any of the key kind of, if you will, the biggest overarching kind of takeaways that you took from that breadth of research that you did.
Terrific. So the scholarly collection that I've edited is called A Critical Companion to Lynn Nottage. For those who don't know, Lynn Nottage is one of our leading voices of the American theater today. She is a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright, the only woman to have accomplished that in the history of the Pulitzer. Of course, she's very widely produced. In 2020, 22, 23, she was the most produced playwright in the American theater. Her play Clydes which is a new play, was the most produced play in America last season. So she's a very, very prominent voice and a very, very important figure in the American theater landscape. And so when I approached that project, I was looking at theater in America at that time, and I was in a production of hers. I was watching the production, and I just, was so amazed by what I was watching on stage, as I always am when I watch her work. And I was watching this play, and at intermission, I turned to my colleague who was at the performance with me, and I said, where is the conversation about her? Where is the scholarship about Lynn Nottage? Because at that point there was no scholarly collection about her. There wasn't a lot of published, scholarly articles about her, even, in journals and that sort of thing. And yet, even that was almost 10 years ago at this point when I asked that question. Even at that point, she was very highly produced. She had already won her first Pulitzer. She's a MacArthur Fellow, one of your peers. And, but there was just no scholarship about her. And yet she is doing incredibly compelling work. She does incredible historical research prior to the beginning of writing her plays. All of her plays are dealing with a history in some way. She does extensive ethnographic research for some of her productions, traveling for extended periods of time to, the far-flung areas of our globe to really understand the communities that she's writing about. She is, an incredible expert at interweaving complicated nuances of social dynamics, and so anyway, I just couldn't believe there was no conversation about her. And I thought, okay, this is it. This is a message to you to, in some ways help begin this conversation and shape the conversation. And so that's how that project really started, was me asking that question: why is no one talking about her in a scholarly academic capacity, right? Certainly she was critically hailed at that point and widely produced, but there just was no scholarship. And so I began to shape that collection. And the collection, I'm very proud of that collection. It's a real representation of the field, I think, voices in our field of American theater, theater scholarship. It contains voices of very prominent senior leaders in our field, and also voices of newer scholars, who were just entering the conversation at that time. And that was, and I said the word conversation, and that was a very intentional decision I was making, was to make this a conversation about her work. I could have written a monograph about her, and maybe I still will, but at that point, the question was, why is there no conversation about Lynn Nottage's work and her impact in American theater? And so I really did want that to be an edited collection of multiple scholars, commenting on, providing insight into, and celebrating her work, and urging the conversation to move forward about her significance in the field. I think so often women playwrights in particular get compared to male counterparts, right? Or successful males who have come before them. And I think that has certainly happened to folks like Lynn Nottage and some of her contemporaries over the years. And, for example, everyone loves to talk about August Wilson, and yet there are many, many other successful playwrights, both of his generation and since then, right, who are having conversations and making, making observations about, the experiences of Black Americans. And so, to only compare her to somebody else, right? Or to always be in the shadow of someone else, I think is a disservice to someone like Lynn Nottage, who is absolutely standing in their own right, as an artist and as a change maker in American theater. So that was really the impetus of that project.
It is amazing and an extraordinary resource that I would definitely point any in our audience to utilize for sure. Well, this is just such extraordinary work you do. Unfortunately, we are just about out of time, but I always like to ask of all my guests, this work, there has to be tough days, and there has to be times when it seems like, whatever your particular goal you're working on is just, difficult to see, or the path is just not illuminating. Just curious for you, are there any mechanisms you use to kind of overcome the toughest times or challenges that you face in, this extraordinary career and work that you do?
Thank you. There are lots of challenges to doing this work and to crafting a life in the arts. But one of the things that is most helpful to me and maintains my passion for the work is to talk with my students about and introduce my students to these incredible voices that are making change and re-envisioning what we think of and how we think of ourselves through theater in the United States. I'll give a brief example. I teach a dramaturgy class here at Chapman University. And again, dramaturgy is the development of new work and using research to support production. And in that class, we certainly looked at the craft of dramaturgy, but we are also looking at very contemporary plays, because I also teach theater history. So we read a lot of old plays together in theater history. And when they come to dramaturgy, I like to introduce them to some really contemporary work, so they really hear what are the voices of today in the theater. And so in that class right now, we are reading all women identifying playwrights of the global majority. And it is really, really powerful and impactful to watch students respond to those voices, who may or may not reflect their own lived experiences, but who have very, very particular viewpoints and are engaged in this project of reclaiming self, of celebrating intersectionality, and also interrogating the ways that culture both enables us to thrive and survive, depending on our identity compositions, or makes that very, very challenging for us. And so it's very exciting to, introduce a new generation to these voices, and to help them understand what the immediate conversations are that are happening in American theater right now. And it also gives me hope for these conversations continuing and having impact in the future.
Wow. Jocelyn Buckner, you truly are one of the arts engines who is powering human creativity in our world. Thank you so much for your work, and thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Aaron. It's really been an honor.